Okay, so it is 10:23. That means it's time now to go on to the second session of this morning's Idea Accelerator. The second session is called How to Regulate More Smartly, Presenting the Regulatory Quality Index. So we've seen that despite what we hear in the media, there are reasons to be optimistic. And now we're going to have a look at how we can translate that into the way that we shape policies and how we get from ideas to creating laws that are sound. So I'm going to hand over to Alexander Skouras, who is the president of KEFiM, a member organization of the European Liberal Forum in Greece. So Alexander, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Lauren. This is a great pleasure to be here with everyone today. We are going to touch on a very important subject, which is regulatory quality. Regulatory quality, in my view, is the software in which our societies run. If you have poor quality of regulations, poor quality of legislation, the economy and society in general cannot work. We have to constantly deal with this problem in many countries that don't have the institutional framework to force parliaments to take care of the regulatory quality of their produced legislation. And a few years ago, I had a meeting with Panagiotis Karkatsoulis, who's the lead researcher for our Regulatory Quality Index, and Effies Stefopoulou, our speaker today, his co-leader in this project. And we were talking about this problem that we face in Greece, where you have multiple laws being passed at the very last second with amendments that change the entire scope of the legislation proposed, that create new spending, new bureaucracies, and everything that can hamper economic and societal growth. And we thought that there must be a good way to measure this, to present it in a quantifiable way, in a measurable way, because it's, as a topic, regulatory quality is very complex, very nuanced, and very specialized. That gave birth to the idea of the Regulatory Quality Index. And with the invaluable support of the European Liberal Forum, we have been able to explore and how such a tool, this policy-making tool, can be implemented in other countries. So we started with Bulgaria and Turkey, which are the three countries that are represented here today. And if any ELF partners are interested to find out more about this, they should know that we are also looking for more countries to expand in the next year, this tool. So a basic question is, what is the Regulatory Quality Index? The RQI, as we call it, is, as I mentioned before, it's a policy-making tool that measures the effectiveness of regulation and the quality of produced regulation within a given country. It consists of 67 variables. 50 of those are qualitative and quantitative. 17 of them are for reasons of taxonomy, and it's been developed by KEFiM. For the first year we conducted this research, we did the Regulatory Quality Index in Greece and found some very impressive results for the year of 2018. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker from the Freedom Research Association, Ali Rıza Çoban. He's a PhD, a senior legal expert, and a member of Association of Freedom of Expression. And he collaborated with the Freedom Research Association, another ELF partner, in order to develop the tool of Regulatory Quality Index for Turkey. But most importantly, he is an expert on regulatory quality issues in his own country. So without further ado, Ali Rıza, the floor is yours. Tell us a little bit about the level of regulatory quality in Turkey and how such a tool could be useful in improving that goal.
Thank you very much, Alexander. I also would like to thank the ELF for their invitation. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As Alexander said, we have not been able to apply the regulatory quality index in Turkey yet, but we are trying to find a sponsor to apply it soon. But we adjusted the index into Turkish regulatory context and found that in total 44 out of 50 variables evaluated in the Greek version of the index were adjustable to Turkish context. This means that 88% of the Greek version is adjustable to Turkey, but especially in second pillar, some necessary practices such as regulatory impact assessment and public consultation are not compulsory in Turkey, and consequently collecting data will be difficult or even impossible. Such lack of data is a strong deterrent in implementation plan. I would like to mention briefly about Turkish regulatory context before touching upon main challenges. The Turkish constitution was substantially amended in 2017, which entered into force in 2018 July. As a result of those amendments, the governmental system was changed from parliamentary system to a presidential system. Following the constitutional amendments of 2017, legislative functions of the executive and legislative branches was separated completely. Accordingly, the executive branch, I mean the president, cannot propose a draft bill to the parliament, and he cannot attend legislative process as well. The president may only publish laws enacted by the parliament or may send back to the parliament for reconsideration. So only members of the parliament may propose draft bills to the parliament. There is no possibility of government bill anymore. But the president may issue presidential decrees which are not subject to parliamentary approval. Firstly, I would like to talk about laws. Regarding the parliamentary process, there is no clear guidance in Turkish legal system stipulating the principles of preparation of draft laws or presidential decrees. There is a bylaw issued in 2006 by the Office of Prime Minister on the preparation of draft regulations, including laws. It includes rules regarding the structure and language of the draft bills. It also requires that a regulatory impact assessment should be made for every draft bill. But unfortunately, this bylaw is only binding for the ministries and public authorities, but not for the members of the parliament. Nevertheless, since 2018, only members of the parliament may propose a draft bill. It means this bylaw is practically inapplicable. Rules of the procedure of the Turkish Grand National Assembly requires that every draft bill should include justification. In practice, requirement of justification is generally met, but quality of justifications is quite poor. Therefore, gathering information about pre-parliamentary phase of a bill is quite difficult in Turkey. Regarding the parliamentary process, there is also no compulsory consultation requirement of bills with the public or civil society. Civil society organizations may informally attend committee debates, but in practice, participation of civil society representatives to the committee meetings is quite exceptional. Lack of regulatory impact assessment and poor justifications, as well as lack of public consultation, adversely affects the quality of parliamentary debates. Turkish parliament is a single chamber parliament, and bills are debated and voted in two steps, first in the committees and then in the plenary. Firstly, the bills are directly referred to the committees by the speaker according to the remit of the committees. There is 48-hour waiting period. The committees may start debating the matters referred to them only 48 hours after the date of referral. The committee should prepare a report about the matter, including justifications for the amendments. Dissenting members may add dissenting opinions to the report. Reports of the committee are submitted to the plenary and distributed to the deputies. The debate in the plenary can start after 48 hours. Firstly, the whole of the bill is debated, and after that, moving to debate on articles of the bill is voted. Each article of the bill is debated and voted separately in normal procedure, and at the end, the whole of the bill is voted. A speedy procedure is possible for basic laws. In that case, bills are debated in chapters which may include up to 30 articles, but articles are voted separately. Recently, most of the bills proposed by the ruling party members are omnibus bills, and omnibus bills negatively affect the quality of debates because completely different and irrelevant issues are regulated in a single bill. The committees are forced to debate issues which are not fall into their remit and expertise. 29 out of 46 laws that were enacted within the last 2 years by the parliament were omnibus bills. It means that 63% of the bills were omnibus bills. Lastly, I would like to talk briefly about presidential decrees. According to the Constitution, the President may issue presidential decrees on the matters regarding executive power. The Constitution prohibited issues of presidential decrees in some areas. It can be said that presidential decrees in the Turkish legal system constitute a substitute legislation rather than a subordinate legislation. They are below the laws in the hierarchy of norms, but they can be issued in the areas which have not been regulated by a law. Following the entry into the force of constitutional amendments, in less than 2 years, the president has issued 64 presidential decrees, while in the same period, 46 laws were enacted. But it can be observed that these presidential decrees are far from being stable and foreseeable regulations. A simple sign is that 26 out of 64 presidential decrees are new ones, but other 38 decrees were issued to amend previous ones. So much amendments in less than 2 years indicate that the decrees were not carefully considered. Preparation of presidential decrees are not transparent and do not include any consultation. It is obvious that the presidential decrees will have a significant share in Turkish legislation stock. Therefore, for the purpose of regulatory quality index, laws and presidential decrees should be included in evaluation to assess quality of legislation properly. As I mentioned at the beginning, the index can easily be adapted to the laws, considering the specific features of Turkish legislation procedure. Although regulatory impact assessment is not effectively implemented, the requirement of justification may be considered as a substitute of it, and indicators may be adapted accordingly. But major challenge is implementation of index for presidential decrees. Collecting data for preparation and adaptation process of presidential decrees can be difficult or impossible. Therefore, implementation of index for laws and presidential decrees separately can be an option. And in that case, indicators may be adapted for presidential decrees separately. Let me stop here. If you have any questions, I will be more than happy to answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Ali Rıza, and for this very interesting presentation. We fully understand that regulatory quality is a challenge in Turkey, but not only there. Besides Greece, Bulgaria has also been a very important case study with the issue of regulatory quality, a country that is an EU member and has been doing very well on different aspects of policy, but also continually is found to suffer on the rule of law. And regulatory quality is a fundamental aspect of the rule of law, and to comment on how Bulgaria can regulate more smartly and how the findings of the Regulatory Quality Index could assist in that direction. We have Svetla Kostadinova, the Executive Director of the Institute for Market Economics, a very worthy think tank that does great work in Bulgaria. Svetla, the floor is yours. Svetla, you may want to...
Yes, I just had to unmute my phone. Well, hello, everybody. It is very nice to be here with all the people from this group. Try to share experience and probably get some ideas on what can be done in their countries and be motivated to continue what they are doing. I also would like to thank KEFiM for the preparation of this regulatory quality index and the invitation to comment on that and the Bulgaria case. And quite honestly, I would say that if we apply this regulatory quality index to Bulgaria very strictly, actually Bulgaria will stand out as a good example in terms of the basic milestones or criteria for a regulatory process. We do have public consultations that are compulsory. We do have a requirement for preparation of regulatory impact assessments. We do have some transparency of the overall process. We do have preliminary legislative program of the government, and almost everything is published. So you would expect that Bulgaria is doing quite well in terms of regulatory quality and in general, better governance. Also, if you look at the index of economic freedom of the heritage and look at the region, you will see that Bulgaria ranks to 36th place in the last 2020 index, which is a very good standing when you compare it to Greece, for example, that is ranked on 100th place, or Turkey that is 71st in this economic freedom heritage ranking. So you would imagine that Bulgaria is a prosperous and a country that should be taken as an example, at least in the region, which of course is not the case, because unfortunately we do have problems. And besides the quality of the regulations, the process that regulations are prepared and discussed, what is equally important is the enforcement and the implementation of regulations. What we saw in the last 4 months during this unexpected COVID crisis is a test of the regulatory process, that we can actually demonstrate that the process itself may be designed to be a good process, but the result is not a good result. So in the last 4 months, the environment that the administration and the government had to actually do to prepare and to govern the economy, we had an emergency, which is not the best factor, and to actually result in good governance and good regulations. We had uncertainty because everyone had to act very fast, and the administration itself was put in such an uncertainty of how long this situation will last, the crisis, how big the damage will be, and who should be assisted and helped, who is the most affected. So when you have a good process of preparing policies or changing regulations, this situation that we witnessed, the emergency, the uncertainty, should have been not such a challenge. But what happened is that in Bulgaria, decisions were made very not so fast. So people expected decisions and changes in regulations that will allow the sectors and the economy to actually adapt to the new situation. But these changes in regulation didn't happen in the first 2 months, so they were delayed. We had unclear and very vague language of all the decisions made by the government and by the parliament. We even have these language problems of fast and emergency regulations published, and nobody understood actually what the regulation was about and who was supposed to comply with the regulation, with the new decision, whether this decision was the last one or you will have the next day another change of the same regulation. Of course, because of the emergency situation, some of the options that in normal times, options on how to react and what to do were not even considered or discussed, which led to wrong decisions, very costly decisions, or delayed decisions by the government. And what we saw during this 4 or 5 months of regulatory activity in Bulgaria, we saw striking lobbyist measures that actually made it through and were enacted. And even the finance minister and parliamentary budget committee chairwoman were against some of these lobbyist measures, but they, again, as I said, were adopted. And now we see the first results of these lobbyist measures related to big spending, stimulus for very small sectors, but very costly. So what is to be expected if we continue to apply this regulatory framework for Bulgaria? Nothing good in our opinion. We as observers see that if something is meant to happen and become a regulation or a change in of current regulations, this can happen despite all the written steps that are compulsory. As I said in the beginning, we do have consultations, we do have publications, we do have impact assessment, preliminary and ex post assessment. So if someone decides that this a certain regulation, costly regulation, will be enforced, this happens despite the written regulatory process. But we have to change this because, for example, if we take the EU plans for the recovery, we see now in discussion billions of euro coming to countries and will be spent for recovery under this repair and prepare for the next generation plan. So if this system now is not working in Bulgaria, imagine what will happen if this system receives a lot of money from EU. So the ineffective regulatory process will actually enhance this corruption that Bulgaria is associated with. And we will have more of the bad results rather than improve the results and improve the system and the regulatory process as such, so to actually enhance the economy. And currently we're discussing in Bulgaria, we as a society, what we should do with this situation and how the recovery will, where the recovery will go. So what we would like to see is the regulation, of course, cutting the red tape. We would like to see regulatory policy that keep the economy going and actually enhancing the economy, but by better business environment that encourages long-term investments and innovation and capital accumulation, not by micromanaging, not by the government micromanaging the business and the economy in general. What we would like also to see is continuing the use of technologies toward more decentralized and less regulated services, especially in education, healthcare, and welfare provision, if you may say, those areas that Bulgaria needs a lot of improvement to increase its human capital and actually to demonstrate that good governance is associated with better regulation and better regulatory process, but targeted towards increasing the human capital of the country. So our expectations are not very positive. because the current temptation of the Bulgarian government to micromanage business decision-making in order to achieve its political motivated goals remains in the country. And unfortunately, the regulatory process in Bulgaria supports this temptation. As I said in the beginning, enforcement and implementation is what is a big problem in the country. And we don't see that the regulatory process actually enhances the enforcement and implementation. As a bottom line, as I would like to pass the floor to the other speaker, I would again congratulate KEFiM for this regulatory quality index, but would like to point out that this is just the beginning of the assessment of the overall effectiveness of the state. And probably the next step is to measure the implementation of the regulations, because that's the second half of the story. Thank you.
Thank you, Svetla. And we will now move forward with our third presentation by Effies Stefopoulou, who's the co-author of the Regulatory Quality Index and one of Greece's leading experts on the subject. She has worked with KEFiM to develop the index, but also has worked in multiple Greek government and OECD programs. So Effie, the floor is yours. And I am sure, because we touched on what the Regulatory Quality Index does a little bit, but as the co-author, I would like to ask you to go into a little more depth so everybody can get a good picture of what it measures, why it's useful, and why it's a valuable policy toolkit for any government and any think tank that wants to promote better regulation. Effie, the floor is yours. And I believe you also have a PowerPoint that you will be sharing with us. And also, before I forget, everybody who wants to ask a question, our speakers, you can either post the question on the chat or raise your hand and keep it raised so I can see it after Effie's presentation and we can give you the floor.
So, hello, everybody. It's always nice to be in a meeting called Ideas Accelerator. It sounds very tempting and nice to me. So let me share, I will share also my screen with some slides on how we designed the Regulatory Quality Index, go a little bit in depth on what it includes and how do we measure regulatory quality. Regulatory quality is a subject with which I deal almost 20 years now. It's been kind of a passion for me. And it has been so because regulation is something that not only affects our everyday lives, it's not something that only affects businesses, society, etc. It affects democracy as well. So a poor regulatory environment, as you very well know, undermines business competitiveness, citizens' trust in government. Many defaults that we've seen during the past years, I think that are based in poor regulatory decisions, because regulatory decisions is the main tool a government, a state has in order to intervene into our lives. And as we don't want bad interventions, and as we want as few interventions as possible, we have to look at the regulatory quality to safeguard that. So what does regulation do is that it safeguards rights, and without rights, there cannot be any liberty, as we know. And that is not, of course, an argument in order to justify every decision a government makes. That's why the better regulation agenda is an agenda that tries to put things in place and arrange and put a framework within which every government shall decide everything. So in designing the index, we took all the items, all the tools from the better regulation toolkit. That means impact assessment, consultation, plain language, well implementation and enforcement of the law, all these pillars of the better regulation toolkit, and we examined it one by one. So we constructed a composite indicator. What the indicator we constructed does is that it shed light on the procedural step of lawmaking. That means that we take the lawmaking process step by step and see if everything has been done properly. And that is a tool for every government that uses the index in order to assist every government to find the pitfalls and what is doing wrong in order to correct the specific step, the specific item, and not look generally at bad quality laws. And also the index is constructed in such a way that it gives comparable data across jurisdictions, because every country has at least 3 steps in the lawmaking process. That means the pre-legislative process, whatever happens in a law when it is drafted, a bill when it is drafted before it enters the parliament. And then that is what happens in the parliament, because many changes happen, as we all know, in regulations during the parliamentary discussion. And then, of course, it is the index examines also how the regulation is enforced and implemented, because we have seen all over the world the regulations which have excellent scores in their text quality, in the procedural and parliamentary process when they have been voted, but finally they're an empty, void tool that has not been implemented. So that cannot be considered a good law if it's not a law not implemented. There is 1 or 2 things that our index does not do, and that is the index does not take an ideological stand. We don't criticize, we don't assess on the law in terms of its content. We don't assess whether, for example, the law is as liberal as we would like it, or as socialist as we would like it, or whatever. We don't assess on the content, on the content of the law itself. And we do not judge, the index does not judge, the policy pursued by the regulation under scrutiny. We might have a bad policy that has been decided by the government, but there is a good law trying to implement this bad policy. We do not make any judgment there. And we wanted it that way in order for every government to be able to adapt our suggestions, to be able to see, to accept what we are seeing, and to be objective, no matter if we evaluate the laws of a liberal government, of a socialist government, or whatever government. We just evaluate the quality of the laws. And having said that, let's just take a couple of minutes to explain why we choose a composite indicator. As Alexandros said initially, there are 67 variables in this indicator. Regulation is a very complex thing, not only for experts, but for lay people as much more than for experts. So in order to examine all the quality aspects of a regulation, we shall look into depth into too many variables. We chose 67 of them. They were initially around 83. We decided to cut down a few in order to have consistency of data that we can find quite easily and not be and be sure about what we are measuring. So we choose a composite indicator because in a composite indicator we can summarize something which is complex, has many dimensions in real life. We can summarize it within a few numbers, and one number particularly in the indicator. It is easier to interpret a composite indicator than a group of variables. A group of variables, there are things that you can lose when you are trying to make any conclusion or recommendation looking into specific data and variables one by one. And what we think it's the most important thing of a composite indicator, in our cases at least it is that the composite indicator facilitates communication. It gives some data that is easily communicated to citizens, to media. When we presented the results of the measurement we did here in Greece, there was quite a big media response to that because they could write a story without being mathematicians analyzing complex Excel sheets and data. But there is a pitfall that we shall be aware of, and we shall be vigilant not to drop ourselves into that. A composite indicator may also invite simplistic policy conclusions. We don't want that. That's why we have the composite indicator, the ranking of the laws, the measurement, but we also have publicized all the supporting data behind it, all the numbers, the variables that we measured, and everything is open there for scrutiny. And there is a link there on the chat area where Alexandros has put the link on where you can find the indicator and how we designed it into detail. So let's go into the thing itself now. The indicator comprises of 4 pillars. And the 4 pillars, as we said, is 1, the first pillar is the regulatory text, the quality of the text.
Effie, sorry to interrupt, but we are not seeing your screen because you said you're going to share your screen.
Sorry, up to now.
You've been doing great so far, but you haven't used the PowerPoint. So it's been all Effie right up to now. So you have to click on share screen and select your PowerPoint.
Oh, you've lost some of them. Beautiful. Like, okay.
That's fine.
I was thinking I was sharing. Now you see it? You see my screen?
Yes, we do, yeah.
Okay, so you lost that, you lost that, you lost that. That's what, you lost that, and that, the regulator. So we are here. Let me hide this somewhere. Yeah, we are here.
You have approximately 5 to 7 minutes left.
Yeah, okay. So that's the most important. That's the structure of the index. As you can see here, the index is constructed in 4 pillars. The first pillar refers to the quality of the regulatory text, and the next 3 pillars refer to the 3 steps of designing, having and voting in the parliament and implementing a regulation. So in each pillar, there are approximately from 15 to 25 questions, which analyze quality issues from each pillar. That means that there are questions that not only ask, is there an impact assessment in place? Yes, there is an impact assessment in place, but we examine in depth the quality of the impact assessment drafted for each specific law. That means it's quite a workload, but we are sure that we are measuring correctly and we are not generalizing. We are measuring, we are putting our fingers on the facts of each regulation. So the first pillar refers to the regulatory text. This examines the quality of the language, the syntax, if it's comprehensible, if someone can easily understand it, and if the average citizen or someone who has who knows a little bit about the policy area that the law is regulates, if someone can understand the law. And we have taken specific recommendations from linguist people and experts in Greece, and we applied it to the indicator. For example, if you have a sentence where you have too many references, secondary sentences in a sentence, that does not make sense in the end. So we try to break down sentences to make them as small as possible. If you have too many passive voices in a sentence, it is incomprehensible. If you have paragraphs that are 50 pages long, that's incomprehensible. These sort of things that how to write clear regulations, and I think many countries, most countries have guidance about how to write clear, comprehensible in terms of text regulations. We have put these standards into our index, and we have asked questions about that. We have based not only in the Greek syntax and grammar the questions we have in the first pillar, but also there is a very nice, if you want, I can send you a nice guidance from on the language of regulations from the United States federal government. And there is also from the French government, where French people have a very strong view about their language. So we have taken guidance, parts from their guidance as well. So the next pillar describes the pre-parliamentary lawmaking procedure. As you very well know, the laws are not made in the parliament. The laws, when they are brought in the parliament, have been worked upon by the administration, in the ministries, by the executive branch, have been consulted upon with stakeholders. So you have a piece of knowledge, a piece of legislation coming into parliament that has to be of high quality, because if you bring into the parliament something of low quality, it's very difficult and very rare to ameliorate it in the parliament. You have to have a good quality initial raw material to start with. So what happens in the pre-parliamentary process that safeguards the quality? First, there is public consultation. You know, there is a great saying, and I think it has been said by Woodrow Wilson, that said that, why shall I use just my mind when I can use the mind of many? That's public consultation. Public consultation is two things. Public consultation is for getting knowledge, because for sure one regulator does not know all the things, even if he or she is an expert in the subject. So bring knowledge from the people, bring knowledge into the lawmaking process through consultation. And of course, consultation is good for democratic lawmaking, in order for people to feel that they take part into the lawmaking procedure and be more affiliated to the final result of the lawmaking process. That's one thing. Another thing is, if the administration and the executive that drafted the law, the bill, has taken evidence into account, because we are pro-evidence-based policy making. We have seen now during the coronavirus how countries that took their decisions based on scientific evidence and data did better than countries that did not base their decisions in data. So we have in this second pillar a whole set of questions asking, what are the data you have used? Where did you get your data from? How do you align your decisions with your data? These sort of questions, all answered in a breadth of questions there, in order to deliver the pillar assessing the pre-parliamentary process quality. And then the bill enters the parliament. When the bill enters the parliament, many things can happen, as you know. The bill can change completely. So we might have an excellent bill just before entering the parliament. Oh, sorry, that's noise from outside. And then we will have the parliamentary process, where the parliamentary process, we examine things like, do we have this law discussed through urgent procedure, for example? If something is discussed via urgent procedure, the quality diminishes. Or do we have many amendments? Do we have relevant amendments? Or just throw, like in a garbage bin, irrelevant amendments that change the nature and the text of the law completely? We measure these sort of things in this parliamentary procedure part. And then we have the implementation. During the implementation, we measure if the law has been implemented and if it has delivered the results it said initially it would deliver. During the implementation, we measure, for example, because many laws delegate the issuance of secondary legislation to the executive, to the administration. If a law has 5 such delegations, for example, and after 6 months of its enactment, none of the delegated rules have been issued, that means that the law is not implemented. That means that the law is just a verbatim thing there in order for the politicians to say they have done something, but in practice, the real results have not happened, and the law stays just as an empty box out there.
Effie, I want you to know you have 1 minute, so
yeah,
you may want to summarize. Yeah.
With the Greek case, where the Greek case, regulatory reform was not something easy, that was not something easily acceptable, but we have since 2006 an obligation to have impact assessment for every law that enters the parliament. In fact, this obligation was implemented since 2010. Back in 2012, due to the memorandum we had during the crisis, we had a law on better regulation, which was good, but was not that much implemented. And last summer, this law has been amended. And we are happy to say that when this law was amended last month, we had also some new guidelines from the Greek state about better regulation, which incorporated many of KEFiM's recommendations and results of the indicator there. Some of the things that we measured, just as a snapshot, and we finished that last slide. Some of the findings, we measured the legislation of 2018. We are measuring now 2019, always the previous year. So we found, as expected, that there is a regulatory inflation in Greece. So in order for a Greek citizen to read all 2018 regulation, he needed to read 26 pages per day, every day of the year, in order to go through this vast, huge volume of regulation. Another thing is that in Greece, we regulate very much by amendments. On average, there are 5 amendments per law. And the worst is that most of them are irrelevant with the main text, the main issue, the core issue of the law. And 72 of them are overdue, are submitted in the parliament the last minute just before voting, with the MPs having no time to discuss and look at them in depth. And also we have regulation by delegation, quite a few of it, because we just in 1 year there were 1,110 delegations to the executive to issue secondary legislation. And having said that, only almost 19% of it were implemented in fact. That means that many laws that pass through Parliament say they are going to do something, but they are not doing it finally. So the whole results you can find in KEFiM Play area, it's in Greece, in Greek, the Greek results, but the methodology and the text is in the link Alexandros said. And for whatever you like to ask for more, please do so. Okay, that's from Greece. I'm here for your questions.
Thank you, Effie, for all the hard work you've done in this wonderful presentation. I would like to invite everyone who wants to ask a question to either raise their hand or post a question on the chat. I see we have a few already. The first one is for Ali Rıza. There's a question from Facebook that wants to know whether the presidential decrees in Turkey are justifiable. Are they like in accordance with the rule of law? That's how I interpret the question by Athanasios Tsuras, by the way.
Thank you very much for this question. Constitution enables president to issue presidential decrees. President may issue presidential decrees in the areas regarding with executive issues, but we have some problems regarding with presidential decrees. First of all, the preparation process is not transparent. We don't know who prepares and those decrees and on what basis. Presidential decrees doesn't have justification or reasoning. That's why we don't know why a specific decree has been issued. For example, some ad hominem regulations were made in the past years to appoint a person as a university director. The conditions of appointing a university director has been changed by a presidential decree. So it is problematic in terms of rule of law. We don't know the reasoning of the presidential decrees.
So there's a lot of area for improvement in regulatory quality there, I assume. The next question comes from Christian Kotarski towards Ellie, to Effie, I assume. Yeah, towards Effie. With regard to implementation, do you have any thoughts on measuring the extent to which governments are committed to the actual ownership over reforms? Ownership deficit was a decisive factor for the failure of reforms in the case of Greece as compared to Iceland, for example. This is, I confirm that the premise is factual, but I'd like to know whether this is an area that could be incorporated in the regulatory quality index.
Yeah, okay, owners, I very much, it's very crucial what Christian says, because ownership of the reforms is something that needs to be there in order to deliver results. And I like very much the example that Christian gives over there. The link he gives is a comparison between the implementation of the Memorandum of Understanding during the financial crisis between Ireland and Greece, which is a very, very good example. Because in Greece, we had this memorandum with quite nice reforms, some of them, some silly ones, some others, some bad ones, some others, as it suppose is the case with the Irish MOU as well. But in Greece, we lacked the ownership of the reform. That's why we made some of the reforms without giving them sustainability. In the index, we try to pinpoint the ownership of the reform by measuring if all the secondary legislation is issued everything that is foreseen to be issued is finally issued within a logical time. We consider that 6 months period is a logical time. If you want to do something, you don't wait for a couple of years, you do it. If you wait for more than 6 years, that means that you lack ownership. You just regulate without meaning to implement it. We have specifically for the MOUs done some work on it. I can share it with you, Christian, later on if you want to hear, on comparing the implementation specifically and the ownership of the Greek MOUs in detail, and we have presented it in the European Parliament with the ALDE party there. It was 2 years ago, I suppose, something like that. But in our indicator, yes, we try to measure it with the only way I found possible to measure, to see the secondary legislation, how it is implemented. But if you have any idea that we could add, please give it to us.
Svetla, I see you want to comment on this. You have the...
Yes, I was just thinking if budgeting for a regulation is a commitment, because sometimes when you do a regulation that you are aware that will not be implemented, you just don't budget it for that. There is a measurement of the, I think there was some other think tank, you can look for similar surveys that actually track if you finance the legislation and you adjust the money to the regulation. So, for example, if you don't want it to be implemented, then you just say there are no money for that, or it's too expensive, even if it's good. So probably a good benchmark is to follow if there are money, and at least you will be able to assess the actual impact of the regulation, the implementation, because it will be budgeted for. That's just a short note.
Thank you, Svetla. And I'm afraid we've run out of time. We just ate up the 5 minutes that Andre gave me to go over our limit, because the previous panel took them from us. So I want to thank everyone. I want to thank ELF and all of our speakers and participants for sticking around and finding out more about this very useful tool. I'm just going to put on the chat an email where everyone who wants to find out more about the Regulatory Quality Index, you can email us at info@kefim.org and enjoy the remaining sessions of this Idea Accelerator. Lauren, back to you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you to all the speakers for going into that detail and really giving us a picture of how we can implement this in practice. So we're going to take a short break again now. The next session will be starting at 11:45. We'll be talking about the climate revolution, what's at stake and how to fight for it. So as before, I'm afraid I don't have tea or coffee to offer you, but you're free to go and grab a drink, take some calls or whatever you need to do. As last time, please just put your microphones on mute and cut your videos if you want to, and we'll be back at 11:45.